something there. That's why I was trying to mute you. I'm sorry. Are you able to hear me? Uh-oh. Did I lose you, Jay? Let's see.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
It's yes, but it says I'm on mute.
You're not on mute. Let me like so let
Okay.
let yeah, I was muting you because I heard you chewing.
Oh, I see.
That's
Okay.
what it was. I'm sorry. I have a no
No,
chewing policy on this
no worries.
space. I didn't let you know before. Anyway, okay. And Paul Thacker is going to be joining us a little bit later. Janine is here with us, so I'm going to get started. Welcome, everyone, to what I hope is a very, very informative. I know this is going to be an important discussion. I am Bryce Nichols. I'm a professor of genetics at Rutgers University, co-founder and member of the board of directors of the nonprofit organization Biosafety Now. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, professor of medicine, economics, and health research policy at Stanford, host of the Consensus of Illusion podcast. And Jay, I didn't get a chance to ask you for permission before we did this today, but can I mention the thing over the last week or no?
Sure.
Okay.
Absolutely.
The reason is I think it's relevant. Okay. So that's why I wanted to bring it up. And I was calling you earlier to see. So I also wanted to mention earlier this week, he won the Courage in Education Award presented at the 16th Annual Freedom Conference. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because it honors his work in educating on the dangers of the COVID lockdowns, which is part of what we're going to be talking about today, because that aspect of Jay's work has been very controversial and polarizing and led to a lot of, um, well, I mean, not anyway. This is what's going to be the driving our discussion today. So, Jay, how are you doing today? Are you okay?
I'm doing great, Bryce. It's been an interesting week to say the least. And I'm really glad for this spaces so we can discuss some of the issues that come up this week. Just to summarize the main point. Stanford. I'm helping organize a conference at Stanford that will focus on civil discussions between people who took very different viewpoints on a whole host of policy topics during the COVID era. And the goal is first to like have these civil discussions, which we really haven't had across people with very, very different viewpoints. And the topics include, the how do you do evidence-based decision making during a crisis, which is a very difficult topic. How, how do you incorporate the global impacts of policies in public health in decision making? The role of misinformation and the control of misinformation via censorship. What are the impacts of that? What are they? Is it wise to try to control misinformation, or is censorship just fundamentally against a basic civil right? And then last, what are the origins of the COVID pandemic, and what's the appropriate way to regulate virology and other aspects of human life so that we have reduced the probability of another pandemic. And the goal is to across all these topics is to bring people together who very fundamentally disagree. What happened was that we put a preliminary version of the event before all of the speakers have been sort of locked in up, and it caused a massive storm of I don't know, what to call it, Bryce, but it's a whole bunch of people who really don't want us to have these civil conversations weighed in on this. And so it's been interesting to watch. I'm getting flashbacks a little from 2020 and 2021 with this crazy pile-on, but I'm still quite optimistic and hopeful that we are going to have a fantastic in fact, we're going to have a fantastic conference on October 4th of this year.
And so, Jay, I wanted to give a little bit more background there and say one is Janine is one of the speakers, and at the conference, and so that's why I'm really happy that she's joined us today. I did want to, and I'm going to give give a proper introduction in a second, but just to frame what Jay said, what really sort of ignited whatever, if we're calling this a firestorm or whatever, were comments from Peter Hotez, who was the most prominent person attacking the conference. And I'll just read two of his tweets. He wrote a thread, but it began, he wrote, by saying, "My goodness, what's happening at Stanford? This is awful. A full on anti science agenda, parentheses, and revisionist history, tone deaf to how this kind of rhetoric contributed to the deaths of thousands of Americans during the pandemic." Then in a later post, he said, "This program indicates the new Stanford president." Now, I'll point out that Jay's conference is going to be begun with some comments from the president of Stanford, will headline the symposium. While I'm all for free speech, this type of anti science aggression doesn't have to be promoted by the Stanford leadership, given the chilling message it sends to the serious science faculty and students. He later went on to ask the president to reconsider speaking at the event. So, with that in mind, so I want to now introduce.
Okay,
Sorry, go ahead, Jay.
before you do that, can
Yeah.
I get a respond just very, very briefly, and then let Janine in? The it's actually misinformation what you put there. It is not even about the substance of the impacts of the lockdowns and all that, but rather the president of the university is just going to be giving opening remarks emphasizing the importance of civil discussion. He's not taking a side on any of these topics. The fact that Hotez is so upset that a major university would host civil discussions by prominent scientists on such an important topic tells you a lot about Hotez and not much about the president of the university or anyone or Stanford. It's I've invited Peter to come to the conference and give his point of view. I would actually very much welcome that. And so the idea that we can't have this conversation because he's so obviously right, that it's dangerous to platform us or something is insane. It's very, very clear that a lot of the public, uh, falls down on multiple on both sides of a lot of these topics that we're going to be discussing, and he's frustrated that we're going to have a platform. If he wants to counter what he deems to be misinformation, he should come and do it in person.
I agree with you, Jay, as you know. And I would like to say that I believe I had asked you to invite Peter, of course, because I thought it would be great. Would like to give him a Magic 8 Ball award if he does agree to come. But joking aside, I want to introduce Janine Yaunis. She is a litigation counsel for the New Civil Liberties Alliance. She began her career as an appellate public defender in New York City, arguing numerous appeals in the New York courts. After she witnessed widespread government overreach during COVID-19, she became a prominent advocate against lockdowns and vaccine mandates. She has been instrumental in First Amendment challenges, including the landmark Missouri versus Biden case, and successfully led efforts to block California's law penalizing doctors for alleged COVID-19 misinformation. She also served as senior special counsel on the House Judiciary Committee's investigation into government censorship on social media. Her writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Tablet Magazine, and Bloomberg Law. She holds a bachelor's from Cornell and a law degree from the NYU School of Law. So thank you very much, Janine. I hope you're able to. I know we've talked about having issues on the spaces. Thanks for joining us. And I was going to hand it over to Jay for leading this discussion with you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me?
Yes, Janine. Thank you for coming on. It's folks. So just who don't know, Janine is my lawyer in this Murphy versus Missouri case. That I think is one of the most important free speech cases in American history. Janine, thanks for coming on.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
So Janine, I invited you to the conference for the panel on free speech and misinformation, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this very strange attempt to sort of demonize the conference or to sort of get it canceled, given that it does actually have a panel on free speech. First you should say it's like how have you how have you gotten involved in this fight? What have you been tell folks what you've been doing with the Missouri versus Murphy versus Missouri case and Missouri versus Biden case, and then like what's your view on the conference and on what's what's happening around it in the last week?
Sure. Well, there's a lot in there, so I'll try to be as concise as I can. As you know, I got pretty involved in sort of anti-lockdown and mandate activity fairly early on in like the summer of 2020, and I was present for the Great Barrington Declaration. That's where we met almost 4 years ago. And in fighting against mandates and learning more and more about what was going on and using social media myself, I became aware of the fact that the government was involved in social media censorship, especially about vaccines, but also other COVID-related topics. And basically, I kind of learned this from my own experience and that of my friends, where we just noticed that whenever the government said, the social media companies had better crack down on this vaccine misinformation, there would be an uptick in suspensions. I started getting nervous myself, and that led me to really look into it. So I brought a case on behalf of 3 Twitter users, a lot of the COVID dissident community might know, Mark Changizi, Daniel Kotzen, and Michael Sanger. And the case was dismissed for lack of standing in early 2022. But because of that, when the attorneys general of Missouri and Louisiana brought a lawsuit that was very similar, they asked me to join on behalf of and a woman named Jill Hines and Aaron Cariotti. And so we circuit, and then we ended up going to the Supreme Court on a preliminary injunction of these plaintiffs. And I want to be clear that the underlying lawsuit is still continuing. In fact, the court just ordered briefing on various issues this week. So we did not lose the lawsuit. The court just said there was not standing for this emergency relief, which is a higher showing. So I guess all of that is to say, I really became very interested in the censorship issue because it was clear to me that the debate on COVID was skewed due to the fact that there was censorship going on and that the government was involved in that censorship. And when the government is censoring also, it's often for political reasons, not because they actually think they have the best ideas. And even if they do, of course, they shouldn't be censoring because nobody has a monopoly on the truth, including the government, and here especially the government. But in lots of cases here, but members of the Biden administration were asking for people to be censored on things that they knew to be true, like adverse effects from the vaccines, just because it would make people vaccine hesitant. And that is, should be completely anathema to a free society. So getting to the conference, I thought it was very important and impressive that we're finally trying to have an open debate about this. I don't think that ever happened. We never really had dialogue between the COVID dissident crowd and the sort of people who wanted to lock down and do mandates and all of that stuff. And I think it's important. It took over 4 years, I guess, to have this conversation. But the fact that they want to shut it down, I think, is just stunning. I mean, I know Peter Hotez is sort of leading that effort, but there seem to be others who agree with him. I mean, if you think you have the best ideas, why not say them? That's why we live in a free society. That's how we reach the best ideas. The notion that you can get at the truth by silencing debate is, to me, completely insane.
Jay, I was going to wonder, do you mind kind of going over, because one of the issues is this question of will both sides be represented? Now, frankly, if nobody wants to come from the quote unquote other side, I have told you, and I've actually asked other people to say,
sorry,
I can hear you. Are you not able to hear me? Oh, crap. You probably should leave and then come back. Okay, I think she left and come back. We'll come back. Jay, can you go over what the sort of the different sides that will be there? Janine, are you able to hear now? Are you able to hear now?
No, yeah, I have to leave and come back. I've had to do that a couple times. Okay.
Okay, go ahead. Jay was about to explain like what the other sides were. I was going to say like, if need be, I can represent whatever side and start attacking people. Just let me know, Jay.
Okay, I mean, sides is funny because these are very, very complex issues, and there's a very wide range of viewpoints on each of these topics that are going to be discussed at the conference. So, like to call it one side or another is I think is overly simplistic. But just to give some sense, like let's just take the misinformation censorship panel. On the one side, if again I'm being overly simplistic, but on the one hand, you'll have people like Janine who very strongly believe, and I just should say I agree with her that that it's dangerous for the government to try to deem to decide what is true and false, especially during a pandemic where you have rapidly evolving scientific information. For the government to push on social media and media to say, look, this is true, this is misinformation. On hot button topics like, do mass work to prevent the spread of the disease? How rapidly does the vaccine wane in efficacy? Are there significant side effects of the vaccines? All of these topics that the government weighed in on are topics that are that if you look in the scientific literature, there's a very wide range. There's a big fight going on. And so, is it wise for the government to weigh in? On the other point of view, I've invited several people, including I think the head of the faculty head of the Stanford Internet Observatory. I've invited. I hope he comes. The argument I think is that it's people look at information on online sources, social media and elsewhere, including information that's just frankly ridiculous and false, and they make life choices on the basis of it. And it's dangerous, and it's the proper government role to make sure that the social media companies act responsibly in not promoting that kind of information. And so it's not censorship; it's just encouraging private actors to act responsibly the way they should, especially owners of these large platforms like X or Facebook or whatever. I mean, that essentially is the crux of the debate or discussion I'd like to have, with I suspect nuances in between. I've invited Janine because I think she's a very strong advocate and understands very clearly the issues around the harms of censorship. I've invited Scott Atlas, who was the subject of, I believe, deeply unfair attacks by Stanford, by the Stanford University itself, culminating with the faculty senate essentially effectively deciding to excommunicate him. He was the chair of neuroradiology at Stanford for a decade. And for the last decade, is a major advisor to politicians on health policy at the Hoover Institute. A full faculty member, a full academic senate member when he was in medical school. That to have him excommunicated really chilled speech at Stanford. So I wanted his point of view there. On the other side, we're going to try to get people who run the Stanford Internet Observatory, which participated in they get grants from the federal government to identify what they deem to be misinformation, and then they go to social media companies and help them identify posts to take down or suppress. So that's the range of sort of viewpoints on that panel. I think I'm aiming at. On the panel on virology and gain of function work, I've Laura Kahn, who's been on the Spaces before, Bryce, as you know, has agreed to participate, as has Alex Washburn. I think they will make the argument. I'm not going to put words in their mouth, but they'll make the argument that it's quite likely that this pandemic was caused by an intentional research agenda, at least in part aimed at preventing pandemics and preparing for them in advance. But that this work is so dangerous that it requires regulation, independent regulation. That's one set of views. On the other side, actually, I just talked to Sunetra Gupta, and she doesn't believe the pandemic was caused by this kind of work. That she thinks biologically it's not possible for this kind of work. She will represent that side in part, and I've talked and I've have some feelers out to some other folks who will I think make the argument that this work didn't likely cause this pandemic, that it's not possible that could have, that in fact that this work is necessary to help prepare for pandemics, that to prepare us to understand the biology so we can get vaccines quickly if there is another pandemic like this, and that we need to involve the scientists that do this kind of work in the regulation, or else the regulation will be too heavy-handed. Right. So I think that's the and in fact we should be doing more of more regulation instead of wildlife trades that bring humans in contact with wildlife in ways that are frankly dangerous. I think that's the range of views I think I would love to see on that panel. I should stop if you have questions, because I've been talking for a
Well,
while. But I can have
Jay, I was
too.
gonna introduce Paul real quick, if you don't mind, because
Yep.
he just joined. Paul, you're. Do you want me to give you a proper introduction, or do you just want to talk about how you're enjoying the terrace in Spain?
Sure. No, you can introduce
Okay.
me.
All right, cool. Paul,
With the
yes?
terrace in there, with the terrace.
All right, so Paul is currently on a terrace in Spain, as he likes to always remind me. He's a renowned investigative journalist based in Spain, mostly found on terraces. He founded the Disinformation Chronicle, a leading newsletter exposing corruption in science and medicine. His groundbreaking investigations, including a 2021 British Journalism Award-winning series for the BMJ, revealed the financial entanglements of medical experts advising the US and UK governments during the COVID-19 pandemic. His expose on Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine trials, also for the BMJ, became the most viewed science article of 2021 and was finalist for a top investigative journalism award. His work has appeared in major outlets like the New York Times, Washington Post, New England Journal of Medicine, Mother Jones. He has consistently uncovered conflicts of interest and corruption from 2007 to 2010. He worked for the U.S. Senate Committee on Finance for Senator Chuck Grassley, where he led a series of high-profile investigations in the U.S. Senate looking into corruption in science and medicine. That work led to significant reforms, including the Physician Payment Sunshine Act and tougher NIH conflict of interest rules, and earned him a profile in Nature. He is a former fellow at Harvard's Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics and has lectured on journalism and scientific corruption at distinguished institutions such as Harvard, Georgetown, MIT, and Brown, but notably not Rutgers. So, Paul, thanks for joining. I guess if you want to make some comments about, I know that you missed the introduction discussion about the conference, but I know you're kind of up to speed on what Peter Hotez has been up to.
Yeah, well, I'll point out that I also, I have no ties to Jeffrey Epstein, except for the fact that I have emailed back and forth with David Gorski, who apparently does, of some point. And by the way, I'll just point out, this to point out, how crazy COVID was, and that we're still dealing with this. When I wrote that, to jump back to that investigation on the problems in Pfizer's clinical trial, which, by the way, no U.S. media picked up, by the way. It was the most cited science article in all of 2021. I did interviews in Korea, Italy, the UK, I can't remember where else. No major newspaper in the United States picked it up. And it was so funny because when I first got assigned that story, I looked at all the documents and secret recordings that the whistleblower had done. I'm looking at this stuff, and I told my wife, I'm like, I'm about to go into a pit. I'm going to go into a pit for 2 weeks. My wife had left the hospital and was finishing up a PhD, so it was kind of a crazy time. And I said it was about this vaccine, and she said, "Which one is it?" And I said, "It's Pfizer's." And she's like, "That's the one we got." And I was like, "Oh shit, I forgot. That's the one we got." I just didn't remember. I just Spain bought what they bought, and I just, my wife's a doctor, so what am I supposed to do for my health? And I just, whatever my wife tells me to do is what I do. So I went and got the Pfizer jab. So I had to disclose that in the piece, and I still got called an anti-vaxxer by David Gorski. It's so funny. I mean, it's just part of the whole craziness of what happened during COVID. So I'm glad that Jay is having this day-long event.
And I should point out that, Jay, you're not doing anything on vaccines at the conference, correct?
I mean, no, nothing explicit on vaccines. I suspect that it will come up in the evidence-based decision-making during a pandemic, because that is that is an important topic for thinking about how to manage a pandemic potentially, right? How you have a vaccine? How do you relax the standards for how you evaluate it when you have a pandemic on? What are the implications of that? Should you do it? I think that there may be folks in that panel who want to bring that up, but that's up to them. I suspect on that panel also will be questions about, to what extent should you take into account the collateral harms from the policies. So, for instance, you close schools, there's and when you know from data that that children are a low risk group of dying from the disease, and you also know that closing schools are going to have tremendous negative impacts on the lives of children throughout their whole lives. How do you account for that? How do you account for the longer term effects of a policy that you adopt when you're in the middle of a pandemic? So I think the vaccines may come up in that panel, but it's incidental to a larger discussion about what should be the standards for thinking about risk thresholds when a pandemic is on.
I did want to ask, I guess one of the issues is not issues, but when we discuss these issues, right? So obviously the space has primarily been focused on, well, it has been focused on biosafety and origins of COVID. And so one thing I want to really make clear about this conference is that there's 4 panels, and that 4th panel is historical. Because this, I would say, you're platforming a discussion of COVID origins that has not been seen at an academic institution. I mean, it's at Stanford, so that's a huge deal. I think just from my perspective, so that discussion on COVID origins and biosafety is incredibly important. But the other discussions have become so polarizing, as I said earlier, and what has happened is this strategy of accusing people that have differing opinions on these various issues, mass mandates, lockdowns, vaccines, of being mass murderers. I can't be any clearer about this. Like that is the way in which you're getting, that's the path to canceling and trying to prevent people with differing views from speaking on these issues. And I think I would agree with people that if people had committed mass murder, they should not have a platform at a conference to speak. I'm fully on board with that. However, I object to the characterization of policy decisions that were made and disagreements on policies about how a vaccine mandate will or will not save life. Those are public health choices and public health policies. To refer to people that take a position that turns out to be wrong, or take a position that doesn't even get implemented, as was the case with the Great Barrington Declaration, to frame them as immoral, unethical mass murderers is essentially the path towards doom. We will never get out of a society that is going tooth and nail, fighting tooth and nail with each other if we do that. And that is exactly what is happening here. You guys might be wrong, but you're not mass murderers. I guess that's a stupid way of saying it. I'm quite disappointed in the way in which the conference is being described, where this broad brush, and Hotez is doing this. He's accusing you of being murderers. Make no mistake.
The thing is, Bryce, this whole thing started almost from the beginning of the pandemic, and I'll tell you, the first time and when I realized something was weird was, I didn't realize things were weird probably in the first year of the pandemic. I was very sheltered because, I'm a freelancer. I work from home, so I don't have to go to an office or anything like that. And my wife had just our daughter had just been born. We have enough money. My wife could take a whole year off from the hospital. So my wife wasn't having to go into the hospital, which would have totally changed everything. My wife was going to the hospital, at the main hospital here in Madrid, the main hospital in Spain. My whole calculation of what was going on and things I would have focused on would have been totally different. But I was very sheltered. And actually, there was a time in Spain, I think my wife did not leave our apartment for something like 43 or 44 days or something like that during this lockdown. And I was the only one person going out. And I only went out to go shopping. That was the only time you were allowed to go out. And so we missed a lot of that stuff. And what happened for me when I first realized something was weird was, it was in late 2020, so the first year of the pandemic. And I ran across an article that said something along the lines of, well, if you think this pandemic came from a lab in Wuhan, that's a conspiracy. And I just posted on Facebook. I was like, I don't know where this virus came from, but it's not a conspiracy to ask that it could have come from a lab. This is stupid. And I put this on Facebook, and I immediately got science writers, because I'm in the journalism world, and I come out of DC. So a lot of these people who I've actually picked on over the years, or actually pointed out how stupid they've been, they're people that I know. I've been over their house, or I've been out at happy hours with them. You know, these are people that I know. Like, they're not some random person on the internet. And immediately, like, two different people. One was a news editor at Science Magazine, and then someone else is at, like, kind of in that same world. And John Travis, who's at Science Magazine, is like, well, you know, Paul, Steve Bannon is saying, you know, that this thing came from a lab, whatever. I'm like, I don't care what Steve Bannon is saying. Like, I don't listen to Steve Bannon's show or, like, follow Steve Bannon. Like, I'm literally just saying, like, this thing could have come from a lab. We don't know how it came. And calling that a conspiracy is just nonsense. You know, and so that was the first time I noticed that there was this, you know, this movement to denigrate people raising questions or asking questions and calling them conspiracy theorists or misinformation or disinformation. So this has been going on for a long time, and their ability. This is a way to try to control what we're allowed to say and what we're allowed to think, because what happened during this entire pandemic was there was a sword and a shield, and the sword was they pushed forward with, you know, narratives and ideas through the mainstream media, which is tied in very closely with the government. I mean, just look and see, like, you know, Fauci is sick. He gave interviews to two people, a woman at the Washington Post. I can't say this woman's name. She's Lebanese. She's got an Arab name, Yatuleb or something. I'm going to totally screw up her name. He gave an interview to her, and he gave an interview to the reporter at Stat News, whose name I'm blanking, Helen Branswell, right? They both have been back-channeling with Fauci forever, right? So he's been back-channeling to them and through others to promote narratives that he wants. And then what's happening simultaneously was alternative ideas. I don't want to say alternative, it's just like other ideas, right? We're being suppressed, you know, and we're being censored through this censorship apparatus that, like, I call it like big disinformation. We'll call it the censorship industrial complex, to shut down other ideas and label them and then remove them from discussion. So that's what we've been dealing with for the last 4 years. And so what Peter Hotez is doing this, he's been, you know, hand in glove with all this crap. So he's just continuing that whole process that we've been dealing with, you know, since 2020 and maybe even prior.
Yeah, can I say one thing on that? So, I mean, what they try to do is there's a First Amendment exception for, you know, incitement to violence, and that's when somebody's basically trying to say get a crowd to go after a specific person and kill them or something, and it's a very narrow exception. And what they're trying to do, in my opinion, is try to draw a similar kind of analogy to that. Like, well, if you make an argument that we shouldn't have lockdowns or that not everybody should get the vaccine, then that will result in a lot of these deaths, and therefore it's equivalent to incitement. So there's a, you know, sort of free speech exception for that, which is absolutely ridiculous. You know, policy discussions about complex issues cannot possibly fall under that exception. But that's sort of what I see them doing with these types of arguments.
Well, Janine, is there somebody actually? I've been very limited in the discussions with people, like in trying to have good faith discussions on people that are, you know, objecting to Great Barrington Declaration and that kind of stuff. But is there this concept that was brought up today by somebody is called social murder? Is that a legal term, or is that just a construct used to describe how policies? Have you heard of social murder? And
Well, I haven't heard that term before. I assume it's what, like, cancel culture.
Oh,
basically.
I know this term. I know this term.
No,
Janine.
it's about how
It's
policy.
a term.
Yeah,
It's
go
a
ahead,
term
Jay.
written first by Karl Marx, actually, in his writings. About, and you know, he was criticizing 19th century British society very, very accurately in that the plight of the working class was absolutely horrific, and his view was that the social system that created those working conditions were akin to murder. But to apply it here is really funny, because the argument on the other side, this is the argument I made in the Great Barrington Declaration and elsewhere, is that the lockdowns themselves killed, starved vast numbers of poor and working class people. It consigned us to a generational inequality. You know, 4.5 million kids locked out of school for 2 years actually 15 million kids locked out of school for 2 years with no school at all in Uganda. And when they opened the schools back, 4.5 million of those kids never came back. And then you have UN reports saying that many of those kids were sold into sexual slavery or child labor because their parents, their families were so impoverished by the economic consequences of the lockdowns.
So Jay, sorry. I guess the thing is, right? So this is where the fault lines are drawn, on this issue for you? Because it's obviously like extremely, you're very passionate about this. Your critics are equally as passionate about saying lockdowns were needed to save lives, and by opposing those lockdowns, you killed people. And you're saying the lockdowns killed people. So this is where we are, which is why
But Bryce,
this
there's a
is
difference, right?
yes.
So I do
No,
not want to cancel
I
the
I
speech
agree.
of these other people. Like they're
No,
what
I
they're
agree.
doing.
It's a
I'm not
yes.
arguing this. Let me, sorry, Bryce. Let me just finish.
Yeah.
Just real
Yeah,
fast.
sorry.
I think it's also it also applies to the debate over the the lab leak and the regulation of virology, right? The idea that I'm putting forward an idea that a policy had such and such consequences, including the unfortunate death of many vulnerable people. Right? That's the idea I'm putting across. I think if you want to talk about that idea, you can't go around and cancel the people that disagree, that put forward the idea, not thinking that it was going to lead to those consequences. Right? So just to bring it to the lab leak idea, right? So uh, the argument that Hotez makes with his anti-science aggression bit is that just saying that this kind of gain of function work may have led to a global pandemic is itself harmful to the people that were doing the gain of function work, because just that suggestion leads to them being criticized in ways that sometimes are quite inappropriate, right? Like death threats or whatnot. If we have this standard that whenever someone brings up a controversial idea, the people that support the policy that's being criticized will themselves be criticized, and therefore we shouldn't be able to criticize them. It's the death of conversation. It's the death of like reasoned discussion about the most important policy aspects of the day. Right. And I think that is the environment that Peter Hotez and others want to create with this. And then you back it up with, as what Paul said, essentially the censorship complex that Janine's been fighting against, where the force of government says, we want to take this one side. Anyone who disagrees with us, these people on this one side are committing social murder and deserve to be censored, or worse. It's very dangerous. You end up with a situation where you cannot have a reasoned discussion on public policy issues, fundamental public policy issues.
Right. There's one other thing I want to add in, Jay, that you brought up about with the lockdowns. This was something, again, very sheltered, right? I mean, I work from home. My clients that I write for, are in the States. My wife has a government job at a top hospital. It's like a 15-minute walk from where we live. So, a little bit in Shangri-La, even, there's a pandemic going on, but something kind of hit me about 6 weeks ago. I was going out to meet some buddies, and I hop into a cab, and I'm sitting there, I'm looking at the cab driver, and I'm like, dude, I know you. How do I know you? I know you. And we start talking. He's like, oh yeah, I used to work at whatever. I'm like, oh my God, this is like a bar in downtown Madrid that whenever I had friends come in, I'd always take them there. It was this great, bullfighting bar. Had all these pictures up there. It was like a huge different mix of people. It was when it first opened up, back I think in the 90s, something. It was famous for a lot of celebrities and stuff would go to this bar. But it was kind of down on its heels when I used to go there. But I liked it even more. It had great music and everything, gypsy music in there. And what had happened is COVID shut down his bar. And so shut down his business. And here he is today, which is 6 weeks ago, I'm with him, and he's driving a cab now, And I don't know how many other stories there are like that where people who lost their livelihoods, and I don't know if he's happier as a cab driver or not. I don't know. I mean, but in my head, I thought he'd probably much rather be running that bar, downtown next to Plaza San Francisco, And so I don't know how many other people that there were like that, whose businesses were harmed and were shut down because they couldn't survive. And the ones that stuck around were not the small businesses, but the big box stores, the chains that can survive because one location isn't doing that well.
So, Paul, I would say here, this bringing it back to this concept of what was the spark of the whole thing? It was the pandemic itself and the cause of the pandemic itself, which led to all kinds of difficult decisions that led to death, that led to economic, distress. And so everyone has a story about how their lives were affected. Some, to extreme, lost family members. This all emerged from the virus itself. The virus itself, many of us think, was created in a lab through reckless virology research. If true, then so this gets to this point of assessment of guilt or who is guilty of causing harm to society. It would fall squarely upon the scientific community, and in particular the enterprise itself that created this monstrous virus that led to death and destruction across the world, which is why I think that fourth panel is so important, because think of how much it's led to divisions across all of these other issues, how much it's led to distrust of vaccines, of hatred of public health officials, of the journals are sort of, not that I liked them before, but the point is that it's polarized us and divided us on many, many issues. The virology, the dangerous, reckless research that's still going on, and again, that's been my focus as this Biosafety Now nonprofit was started on, is to stop that, to prevent that from happening again, so we don't have to be at each other's throats about, was this policy causing mass death, mass poverty. So that's why I think this conference is so essential, because these issues have divided us. And one of the things that I really appreciate working with Jay is because I used to think Jay was, his policies were terrible or whatever. I don't anymore. I understand, yeah, go ahead, Paul.
I know that because I had those conversations with you.
Exactly. And this is why I think what I've really been very glad to have, I guess, whatever. I'm not saying I've grown. I mean, I've just been a little more open-minded. I mean, it's been great. And I would say I'm going to introduce a concept here. This is from Jay, because Jay, you're going to like this. I'm going to say radical forgiveness. This is something that I'm trying to do better on, which is to try to say, look, we don't agree on certain things, but you're not my enemy. You are not someone that is a mass murderer. But I think it's been tough. It's been tough across these issues because they are. Yeah, go ahead, Jay.
Sorry, Bryce. Yeah, I mean, for me personally, that idea of forgiveness has been pretty central to how I've survived through the last 4 years. It's been quite tumultuous for me personally. But I think from just broadly from a social point of view, I think, think about what happens when you have an airplane crash, right? You have a disaster. You have an analysis. You have like an independent analysis of the black box, and you try to figure out what went wrong. The goal really isn't to point fingers and lay blame. I mean, this is a very complex situation, and people are making things that there a lot. There are. Now, I'm not saying there aren't any bad actors involved. A lot of people opportunistically got involved and took advantage. But I think the root cause, I agree with you, Bryce, is the root from which it starts is this dangerous research that's been done. But even there, you can make an argument that they were doing it in good faith, that they honestly thought they were going to prevent pandemics with this kind of work, and it just went awry, right? That's one possible story. To me, the constructive thing is not who's to blame. The constructive thing is, how do we reform our society so that things like this don't happen ever again? It's so much harm done to basically every single human on the face of the earth by this whole structure of what happened in the last 4 years. How do we make reforms in our society so these things can't ever happen again?
But Jay, I disagree on that point, because I think accountability is important.
Exactly.
I think, but the problem is that the words, like what has happened is the words accountability have no meaning when you accuse everyone of murder. So you're losing the fact that a small group of people made a mistake, perhaps. That's still a mistake that led to all these harms and needs to be held accountable. So so not saying, I mean, Jay, actually, this whole thing of radical forgiveness, I really think is critically important for all of us, but it is important to hold bad actors accountable. The problem is when you label everybody a bad actor, you just can't do that. Go ahead, Paul. Sorry.
The concept in journalism is name and shame. You have to name who did what and then shame them for it. That's how the process works. And, I don't I'm sort of along the lines with Jay, having worked in, I'm sorry. having worked in the government, like in the Senate, I understand that things can get really screwed up. There's things that have happened when we pulled people in from agencies or from institutions, and they walk you through and they explain to you what happened, and things just screwed up, and that's what happens. So I don't really have a problem with the fact that the government made mistakes. My problem with the mistakes they made is that they did not allow anyone to ask questions, to question what they were doing, and to question whether they're making a mistake. That was the problem. And that's why I think it still is that 4 years afterwards, we're still sitting here like, what the hell happened? Because we never really had an honest discussion throughout the entire process during this pandemic. It was shut up, you're an anti-vaxxer, you're an anti-masker, you're whatever like the anti-thing was, conspiracy thing was of the moment, And so there was never an honest discussion about what was going on, and I think that like still needs to happen, And so I have no problem with pointing out what people were wrong. And I'll tell you something, like, one of the things, like, when I explained, like, when I knew something was wrong, when I pointed out on Facebook in 2020, like, this pandemic could have maybe happened from a lab. I don't know. Like, why are you calling it a conspiracy? The same thing happened for me, like, when I was like, okay, who is this guy, Jay Bhattacharya? And there was an opinion piece in the BMJ that said, Jay Bhattacharya and these Great Barrington guys are terrible and awful. And it was written by this guy, Gavin Yaney, who's a bit of a narcissist, like a third-tier academic at Duke, and David Gorski. And the thing was written, it was constructed in such a terrible way. And it was like the same thing, that overreach. It was an overreach. It was like trying to label something, that didn't make any sense to me. Because, like, and what it tried to say was he had these conflicts of interest with going to this Great Barrington conference, and it had like it like jogged together this idea of Koch funding. I've actually worked on this issue of conflict of interest. I wrote a law on it. I know a little something about it. I've given talks on this issue of conflicts of interest. This thing was totally like fabricated, this conflict of interest, when I read the piece. And I was like, okay, wait, what is going on? Like, what does this need to construct this fairy tale conflict of interest about this guy? And so that's when I started like to look at, okay, who is this guy? And so I think that's one of the things that happened during the pandemic was there was a lot of overreach in labeling people and creating ideas of who they are and not really having a discussion. It wasn't like this idea, this guy, I never read the Great Barrington Declaration. I never read the thing, I mean, I never read, there was a counter thing. I can't remember what it was called. That, I never read that either, like these were things that like were happening, blowing past my head when they were, as they were happening. But it was like, here it is like afterwards, and there's these, accusations made about it. And then when I look back and I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, what are you doing? And so what happened a lot were these attacks to label, to like disenfranchise people, to throw people in a corner, and to not like deal with what they had to say, because it was people in power who thought they had the power to do this to people. And that's what happened. For like 4 years we dealt with it. We're still dealing with this. That's what Peter Hotez is doing right now.
Jay, sorry, I cut you off before. I was
Well,
going to say
I just
sorry.
wanted
Go
to bring
ahead.
Janine in. I want to bring Janine in because she and I were writing a piece about. We actually have to get back to this, Janine, about the consequences of the censorship complex, the censorship and the suppression. Would you like to talk about that, Janine?
Sure. Well, I mean, because we don't really, well, it's hard to know exactly what the alternative universe would have been, although we can look at countries that didn't lock down like Sweden. There are obviously other factors there. But I think the point that we're trying to make overall is that the censorship had real world consequences in terms of life and death. I mean, there was no debate about whether lockdowns were mandates or vaccines for young people. Or even masks, which maybe didn't kill anyone, but one could also argue that there was a maybe false sense of security for allowed to rely on masks when maybe they shouldn't have. So all of the fact that censorship, I think, is really frightening, and kind of highlights why we have a First Amendment. That was that's the logic that the framers of the Constitution had, was that the truth is best reached at through discussion and debate, and that especially the government, doesn't have a monopoly on the truth and shouldn't be able to decide what should be heard and what's false and should be silenced. I mean, sort of the counter argument, and I think it's important to understand it, is especially in this day and age, there's so much information. We're exposed to so much. It's hard to know what's true, and I find that myself. There is almost an epistemology more. I don't have time to research everything. I had a lot of time during COVID to do my own research and I think reach my own conclusions about what I thought were the best scientific arguments. But I don't have that time now. So who do you rely on? And we're just inundated with so much. So I think, that's the counter argument. And I think it's worth engaging with because it is a problem. But also, logically speaking, and that the best cure for problematic speech or untrue speech or hate speech or whatever is counter speech, and for people to explain why that's wrong. And another thing to keep in mind is that censorship doesn't necessarily mean the ideas go away. It just tends to drive them underground. So I think it's actually better for counter them.
The interesting thing about that is this is the same that counter argument is it's actually directly analogous to the counter argument to the argument made by ecclesiastical figures during the early days of the Enlightenment, right? So the argument was that you have a printing press that allows the mass dissemination of dangerous heretical ideas, and so you need to have some central authority saying, Galileo is not allowed to print his book about about the moons of Jupiter or whatever, or the heliocentric theory, right? I mean, the idea that a central authority is the solution to this information problem is ridiculous. It's just frankly ridiculous.
Especially since, as I discussed earlier, I mean, politicians often have motives that are not the well-being of people.
That's true.
But rather, their own pursuit of power and authority. And I mean, that was very, very clear with the emails that I've looked at from the Biden administration, where they're often acknowledging that, well, these things are true, but they would impede our ability to, get everyone vaccinated, which we've made as sort of a platform of our administration, and we need to do that for political purposes. And with the Hunter Biden laptop situation, which is obviously not about COVID, but the FBI did that presumably on its own. I don't think at the direction of Trump. So some of this going on under the Trump administration, the evidence we have doesn't show that it was going on at the direction of the Trump administration, and that's in contrast to the Biden administration, which sort of then took over, especially the COVID censorship, so it was really a different situation. But the FBI clearly tried to subvert the Hunter Biden laptop theory for purposes of undermining Trump's candidacy. And I'm not a Trump supporter, so I don't have any political motivation to put forth that theory, but I think it's pretty clear. And in fact, Mark Zuckerberg admitted it in his letter that was released yesterday or 2 days ago.
Jay, I was going to say Laura Kahn is wanting to say something. I don't know if you, Laura is one of the speakers that Jay mentioned. She's going to be talking in the Origins and Biosafety panel. Laura, can you unmute yourself and you had a comment?
Yeah, thanks, Bryce. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Well, I just wanted to say a few words and put some of this into historical context. First of all, after having researched leadership during many epidemics, getting it right is very, very hard, particularly if there's a lot of scientific uncertainty with a new pathogen, such as SARS or MERS or COVID-19. You really don't know how this microbe acts, how it spreads, how lethal it is. You don't know any of that with a new pathogen. So from a public health historical perspective, the gold standard of public health response has often been cited as the 1947 smallpox outbreak in New York City. And the reason why that was a gold standard, and of course there were important historical precedents before it. The U.S. was an optimistic nation. It had recently won World War II. The public trust in government was very high. So it was a very different society than what we're dealing with now. But I just want to say some of the things that they did back then would probably not be acceptable today. Um, there was a person, a merchant who came to New York City in February of 47. He took a bus from Mexico and arrived into the city. He was not feeling well, went to a hospital and was hospitalized. He subsequently developed smallpox, but it wasn't recognized initially. And the mayor at the time, Mayor William O'Dwyer, had appointed a Dr. Weinstein to be the city's health commissioner. And they decided to have a mass vaccination campaign, in addition to an intensive surveillance effort to try to identify people who developed smallpox. Now, it's important also to recognize that smallpox had been well recognized for centuries. So this wasn't a new pathogen the way we're dealing with coronaviruses. Smallpox was well known, and there was a vaccine readily available, even though it was a rather dangerous vaccine. So, so because public trust was so high, there were so many volunteers that in less than a month they were able to mass vaccinate over 6 million people. 12 people came down with smallpox and only 2 died. Now, there were problems with the vaccine, and they had 46 cases of encephalitis from the vaccine, and 8 people died from adverse effects from the vaccine. So it's a dangerous vaccine. But nevertheless, the response was hailed as a great success. Now, there were efforts by some people to provide misinformation during the campaign, and the city government managed to convince the press or whoever to not publish it. So you could argue that was government suppression of misinformation. Um, there were problems with that response, but very few people died from the disease. Now, you contrast that with the smallpox outbreak of Milwaukee in, let's see, what year was that? Hold on one second. I contrasted it between the two. It was about 50 years earlier. And in that outbreak, there was very little public trust by the government, and there were riots in the streets. The press were blaming poor Polish people on the south side of town as spreading the virus, and they wound up having over 1,000 Milwaukeeans come down with smallpox, and 244 people died with riots in the street. So so leadership, communication, these are all things that are extremely important. Back then, that was dealing with a well-known pathogen, smallpox. But when you're dealing with an unknown pathogen, you really, all bets are off in terms of lethality, spread, and all of that. So it's very hard to get it right. And I think for the leaders who are trying to do their best to try to save lives, we can't demonize them. I think for the most part, and I'm not going to name names of politicians who I did or did not agree with, but for the most part, most were trying to save lives, and I think we need to keep that in mind as
But
we.
Laura, do you agree with this concept of noble lying? Because a lot of the defense of some bad like cases where public has been misled in COVID is sort of framed as a noble lie. Is that something that
Well,
you're?
I'm not supporting lying. Part of the problem, and D.A. Henderson, who managed to stamp out smallpox, I interviewed him for my first book. And he said one of the problems is a lot of political leaders want to try to reassure the public that everything is okay when in fact they have no idea if it's okay or not. So they try to appease the public when what they should be saying is, we really don't know. Nobody likes to admit that they don't know because it sounds like they're not a good leader. And so that's where the problems, if you're honest and you say, we really don't know how this virus spreads, we really don't know how it started, we don't know a lot of these things, but we're going to try and do what's best to keep everyone safe and alive, that probably would have been more acceptable than just, saying, oh, it's, we'll contain it soon. It's nothing worse than a cold. I mean, a lot of the rhetoric was just really misleading from very early on. And that really set us up for failure.
What I like what Laura is saying is, first off, like, I mean, the fact that you like talk about the fact that there were adverse events to those vaccines is like amazing, because I mean, there was a time, and I think people are going to forget this. There was a time when you were not allowed to talk about adverse events to the COVID vaccines. That was just not allowed.
Right.
I mean, the fact that like I wrote this piece for the BMJ about corruption in their clinical trial, like, I'm listening to some of these other reports, like kiddo, you ain't it. Like, I have like internal documents. I have secret recordings. I mean, this woman like gave us so much information we had to go through. It had to clear defamation purposes through England, which is like crazy. Like, it's a crazy hurdle, and people just did not like to even acknowledge that like that was an issue with the Pfizer clinical trial. Not only that, but like the FDA didn't even go in and investigate afterwards, after they were told by a criminal investigator, after a person who reviewed the documents was the one who ran FDA Office of Criminal Investigations. She was the lead investigator for investigating criminal issues inside the FDA. She looked at what happened with that Pfizer clinical trial, and she said the FDA was complicit in it. And so, I mean, there was a time when we weren't allowed to talk about these issues. And this is the other thing I think that you brought up was really great. I had no problem at all with, again, I've worked in the government. I know how it works. I understand how government works. Like, people screw up. People don't really know. And, like, I had no problem at all with people coming out saying, like, we don't know what's going on, because that's how it works. When you're, like, at the top, I don't care if you're a mayor running an agency or the president or whatever, you oftentimes don't really know what's going on. You're trying to make the best decisions based upon like not that great information. I was also in the Army. Like, I was served in war, so like I understand like how those things operate. Like, you don't really understand what's happening all the time, but that's all you got to do is just say that, like, hey guys, based upon what we know right now, with the best information we have right now, here's what we think is the best decision to make. That's a fair call, and I think people can get behind that. But that's not what happened during this pandemic. It was like,
right.
This is true. This is false. You're anti-mask. You're like, and that to me was like the thing that was like why we're talking about this today, because we did not have an honest discussion.
That's
Laura.
exactly right. No, that's the problem. There wasn't honest discussion. There was a lot of, from the top, leadership giving misinformation, refusing to wear masks to serve as a role model, admitting that we don't know a lot. There was none of that. So, I mean, from the very beginning, we were set up to fail. And it's one of the great tragedies that's going to go down in history in this country, of how catastrophically bad our response was in almost every way, shape, and form. We, compared to our other similar nations, we've done by far the worst. And it's a great embarrassment, which is why we need to get to the bottom of all of this and have the discussions such as this, which is why it's so important. But honesty is critical, and unfortunately, it's seriously lacking. And open and honest debate is essential. So anyway, those are my 2 cents.
Thanks, Laura. And I forgot to mention, so Laura's also in biosafety now. But what's interesting too is that Laura, do you want to mention, like, you were you were involved at the sort of beginning of coming up with the One Health stuff, which is, of course, now
Yeah.
linked to EcoHealth Alliance. But it's sort of like, well, do you want to clarify exactly what I meant by that, just so that I don't
Yeah,
misrepresent it?
sure. Well, look, from the 20th century on, we saw increased numbers of epidemics, pandemics, not a pandemic, outbreaks, epidemics from zoonotic diseases, disease of animals that infect humans. And yet, in the work that I did at Princeton, I saw that physicians and veterinarians rarely, if ever, communicated or collaborated with each other. So the One Health initiative was an effort to just increase communication and collaboration across the professions, because the pathogens don't recognize a distinction between humans and other animals, but we've placed arbitrary barriers between us and the other species. Surveillance of disease is bad, and well, I shouldn't say bad, is challenging enough in humans, much less in the other animals. Coronaviruses have been a problem for domesticated livestock, particularly in this country, since the 1930s. The veterinarians have been battling for decades coronaviruses, deadly outbreaks, and we, in our thinking that we are separate and above all the other animals, thought that we were immune. Well, that's not the case, as we've discovered in the early 2000s. But so anyway, so that's how the One Health Initiative was established, and in no way, shape, or form did we advocate for gain of function research on pandemic potential pathogens. Mother Nature is very good at killing us and the other animals. We don't need to help Mother Nature along by making the pathogens even more communicable or deadly. And that's what's gotten me so upset about it all.
And
But
I was going to say, oh, sorry, go ahead, Paul.
But Laura, a lot of the One Health money is pouring through where I went to school at UC Davis. That's where a lot of the money is cycling through.
yeah,
That actually was supporting Peter Daszak and EcoHealth Alliance. I'm blanking the name of the woman at UC Davis who has is sitting on a lot of that money that's coming through.
right.
I mean, that's a perfect school for what you're talking about, right? I mean,
Yeah,
Davis is one of those few schools that has like great science,
yeah,
a veterinary school, and a medical school. Like another one that's similar, because like a lot of my professors when I was there, they all came from Cornell. Like it was the same
right.
thing, right? It's like medical
Well,
school, veterinary school, good on sciences. You
Da-
know,
Davis actually had an advantage because they're all geographically located in the same place. Cornell, you've got the vet school up in Ithaca and the medical schools in New York City. So the ability to communicate and collaborate is very challenging for Cornell, not so for Davis. I mean, Davis has a great One Health Center and a lot of activity, and it's unfortunate that they got involved in with EcoHealth Alliance's work. I mean, I don't know how much Davis got directly involved with the research in Wuhan, but look, I think it's a good idea to know what's in the virus sphere. What viruses are out there in animals that could potentially spread to humans. But that doesn't mean we should be manipulating them to see. Well, let's see what will make them jump species. Uh, let's start manipulating them and find out. Like I said, we don't need to help Mother Nature. We just need to know what's out there, but we don't need to start futzing with them. We don't futz with clouds to see. Well, let's see what'll create a hurricane or a tornado. Let's futz with the clouds and see what conditions will set it up. We don't we don't want to do that any more than we want to do it with the viruses or the other pathogens that are in our world. So, we need to be smart, not, humans are very curious species, but sometimes we do really stupid things.
My idea along those lines that you have is like, well, let's create a Godzilla to see like what happens if there's a Godzilla, so we know how to like protect ourselves against a Godzilla if a Godzilla ever appears. And you're just like,
That's
wait,
exactly
what?
right.
It's like a little boy like screwing with a snake. It's like, don't touch a snake because they're dangerous. And you're like, leave the snake alone. Just leave it alone.
Well,
don't screw with it.
Just because an experiment can be done doesn't mean it should be done. But that takes a level of foresight and caution that, a lot of people just don't think about. But, some of us just think that these experiments are more dangerous than they're worth. That just simply don't do it. But yes, there are people who are very curious. Well, let's see. What happens if I stick a furin cleavage site in this spike protein? Let's see what happens. I mean, the virologists have been doing that since 2005. They've been sticking in furin cleavage sites. I mean, it's not new science. They've just gotten better at it. And, and then it's finally caught up with us.
Laura, can I jump in for a second? So first, I really appreciate your remarks about the difficulties of managing pandemic when there's deep uncertainty. I wanted to just highlight just to bring back to the topic of the spaces. Academic conferences like this, I think that you've so gracefully agreed to speak at is our way that we learn about the mistakes that we made or didn't make. And so, like, I don't really. It's really quite frustrating to see people like Peter Hotez try to effectively cancel it, like to problematize having a discussion at all around these topics. I mean, there's a lot that you said I think would be really it would be worthwhile going into. So for instance, the noble lie, it wasn't just lies by political leaders. It was also lies by public health officials. Or exaggerations, for instance, about the evidence on the waning of the vaccine efficacy, or the exaggeration of evidence on mask efficacy relative to what the randomized trials were showing. I mean, these were like conscious decisions, and I completely agree with you, Laura, that part of it is you don't want people are asking you what should you do, and if you're a public health official, you want to give an answer. So the question then is like, what role should there be this kind of like repression of conversation, repression of criticism of decisions made by political leaders, of course, but also of public health officials? Like the sense I got during the pandemic, and is that it was like somehow outside the bounds to say anything to contradict anything that public health was saying, which, fair enough if you're talking about, does smoking cause lung cancer or is smoking bad for you, where science is absolutely settled, versus a situation like this where there's a lot of fights going on even inside the scientific community about each and every one of these aspects of things. Why should scientists and others not be able to talk about that uncertainty just because a public health official says, X, Y, or Z is true, even when it's not actually rooted in solid science?
That's a great question. I don't have a great answer other than during a crisis situation like a pandemic, you want to appear in control. Like I said, people don't like admitting they don't know. It's very hard to stand in front of a camera, microphone, and say, I have no clue what's going on. You're going to be out of a job if that's the case. Or you have a political leader that's breathing down your neck and saying, I want you to. Did you ever see the movie Jaws?
Yeah. I mean, I say I'm very comfortable saying I don't know, Laura.
There's no shark that you have to worry about. We're not going to screw up our business environment. There's, everybody into the water. It's kind of similar to that. Now, I've never been the one to stand in front of the microphone, during a crisis situation. I've just studied it. So I can't tell you what kind of pressure one might feel in trying to convince the public of why they need to follow your policies, even though you really have no clue if they're effective policies or not. You're just winging it. And, the end result is what we have seen. It can be quite disastrous. So,
Laura, it's funny you bring that up, because Jay and I have talked together where I was asking him, if you go back and look early on in the pandemic, you had everyone, public health officials saying masks don't work, right? That
Yeah.
was the
Yeah.
World Health Organization.
Yeah.
That was Tony Fauci. That was the woman, I'm blanking on her name right now, in charge of COVID in the UK, Dame Jerry, I can't remember her name. The woman in Canada also, whose name I'm blanking on right now. They all said the same thing. Because I didn't notice at the time. Like, I mean, I just didn't notice. It was only in retrospect when I looked back at this and I said, wow. And then they all changed. They all did like a 180. And I called it the March mask flip-flop, where they all did a flip-flop in March. And I was like, what caused this? Like, there was no new research that came out or anything like that. And I was trying to figure out, like, why would people do something like that? And I was thinking that it's sort of along the lines you're saying. It's like, how can you go forward at that time and tell people, you know what, here's this pandemic coming. We don't know what to do. Just, like, sit tight and wait. And in my
Yeah.
head, I thought, this reminds me very similar to, there's a lot of great research on the fact that when you go and see your physician and you leave, they want to write you a script. Why?
Yeah.
Because you showed up there and they've got to give you something to show
That's
that
right.
you came here, and they can't say, like, okay, well, you're sick, like, just go home, and, like, there ain't shit I can do for you right now. Like, it's like, I got to give you something. So they give you this thing, and it might be like, acetaminophen, an anti-inflammatory, a pain thing, an antihistamine, whatever. Like, it's really just nothing, but they're just giving you something so that you feel like you got something for that interaction with a doctor. And I feel kind of like that was happening at the public health level. It's like everyone put on a mask, and then okay, that's not that terrible. But then what happened was these, like, mask mandates for, like, little kids in schools, which, like, that's when it became like, hey, what's going on here? It's like, I didn't care about wearing a mask. Like, I just wore a mask during the first year of the pandemic because, that's what I was being told. And that's what came down in the States. It came down in Spain too. And then what happened with me was I'm on a listserv with, like, about 150, 130 different physicians. And a lot of them were saying, like, there's actually not much evidence that masks really work. And I was like, wait, what? Why are we doing this then? Like, what's going on?
Well, the
And
irony is that in one of the very early New England Journal of Medicine articles, where they had reported about the initial cases in Wuhan, they mentioned that we're concerned this is airborne. In one of the small sentences in that text, if you plow through it closely enough, it says we're concerned that this could be airborne, and that concern did not appear to gain traction anywhere. Now, part of the problem also is they were probably assuming that it was going to follow the same pattern of transmission as SARS-CoV-1 from 2003 and MERS, neither of which were as transmissible as COVID. And I have to admit, when COVID first appeared, I thought, one of my friends said, "Oh, should we be worried?" And I said, "Well, if it's going to work like SARS and MERS, it'll burn out. It's not that transmissible." And I wasn't, quite frankly, that worried. But when I saw how fast it was spreading, I said, "There's something different here. This is very concerning."
It's funny you bring that up because right early on, I saw a woman who's, like, followed, like, is now one of the COVID experts for Kaiser Family Foundation, like that media outlet that they have, Kaiser Family Fund. I can't remember what it's called. And she was like, "Oh, sorry, COVID isn't that bad. Like, make sure you get your flu shot. That's much more important." And then I saw that. Then that was retweeted by Laura Helmuth, who's this kind of, like, out of control woman who runs Scientific American. She retweeted that also. So, like, early on, they're all kind of like, "Don't worry. This is, like, all nonsense. Like, the main thing you have to do, like, for public health is to get your flu vax." This is like in February, March of 2020.
Right.
And I was kind of like, well, I don't know if that's true or not. Like, what's going on?
Can I just connect this to the censorship discussion? Because, like, I think that Laura, what you described is exactly the dynamic. The dynamic is that you have someone who's the public is looking to for advice about something that they're very scared about, and they don't know the answer. And it is difficult to say, I don't know. I mean, it's absolutely. I've been in that situation where I'm in front of lots of people looking at me, and you have to, like, I think that has to be part of the discipline of public health to say, I don't know. The problem with the censorship thing is that rather than you've made a mistake. Like you said X, Y, or Z, and it turns out that in fact that's not the case. That's the scientific evidence comes, like the COVID is airborne is a perfect example of this, right? The WHO long delays before they admit the obvious fact from January 2020 that's airborne. What do you, like at that point, what do you do, right? A lot of the censorship efforts, especially the like trying to get this conference canceled, has to do with covering up the mistake that was made in the context of not knowing what to do, rather than just honestly saying, look, we didn't know, we made it. I mean, I think it's much more easily forgivable for the public. And if you look at public trust in public health now, Laura, I've never seen it so low.
No, I agree. Well, the problem is, you admit first that you don't know what's going on. You risk, of course, criticism. But if you're making stuff up as you go and you wind up being wrong, and then you say, well, guess what? We screwed up and we're backtracking and it's not what we said initially, but now we're changing course. I think you've completely lost public trust. So you're going to risk losing public trust, whether you're making it up on the go and then you change, or you try to cover it up. You've lost public trust. I mean, there's so many ways to lose public trust. And because it's so hard to admit right up front that you don't know, because everybody's looking to you for answers, but it's very, very hard to do. So, public trust has been lost. It's a fine line to walk, very easy to lose, and we've lost it, unfortunately. The other disadvantage that the U.S. had was we had dodged the SARS bullet, for better or worse. The countries that dealt with SARS actually dealt with COVID a bit better because they were prepared, they had practice. We didn't have, I think we had like 2 cases of SARS. It was really quite extraordinary. And I remember distinctly back in the early 2000s, the U.S. dodged the SARS bullet. That has its pluses and minuses because we don't have practice now, unlike Canada or certainly a lot of the Asian countries that had to deal with SARS. They handled it much better than we did. We never really dealt with something like SARS or MERS or COVID for years, other than the 2009 influenza, the swine flu fiasco, 2009. It wasn't really a fiasco, but we were concerned that it was going to be a big problem. It wound up.
The advantage that we had with SARS-1, that 2003, was that it's not actually particularly transmissible in humans.
That's right.
I mean, that actually comes back to the gain of function work. Like that actually was a natural origin virus, I believe.
That's right. Oh, yeah.
And it wasn't particularly well adapted to humans when it first entered human population. So it enabled a public health response that was like, like it gave us time. Whereas like the 2020, the virus as it entered was supremely evolutionarily. It was adapted to human transmission in ways that you would. I mean, it's just very surprising, right?
Well, they were able to contain SARS without a vaccine. Just public health 101, isolation, quarantine. It helped it helped to contain it. MERS is still kind of percolating along. Every once in a while, there's more cases of it, but nothing like COVID, which is just, kind of like a racehorse straight out of the gate. So it was a different can of worms. And, I have lots of comments about, its origin, but, that's not what the discussion is today. But
Laura, I wanted to bring in.
It really is.
Wait, can I bring in? Hold on, Paul. Can I bring in Yana? Just has joined us. Yana Lambertinu is another member of Biosafety Now. I wanted to have her say a comment if she. Hi, Yana. How you doing?
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, great. I really, really appreciate this conversation, and just couldn't hold back from just wanting to inject one comment. And that is that you know, even though you know we think that and I think that there's the assumption that the public needs to have clear and authoritative answers, even at times of crisis. I am not sure that there's really a whole lot of evidence to support that. And crisis after crisis has shown us that the public, by and large, tends to recognize BS in authoritative claims that simplify very complex situations. And by and large, the public tends to appreciate officials' humility and transparency and slow and careful advancement of scientific and other knowledge, and especially in contexts of crises where there's a lot of unknowns in the beginning. And I think that a framework that at least I find useful and also troubling is that crises are also opportunities for some classes to control and disempower the public, while at the same time advancing specific narratives and specific interests, even if those narratives and interests place the public at prolonged or increased risk. And I have these, this question about how the crisis that was created by this pandemic was used and exploited by the virology community, the public health community, governmental communities, precisely to control and disempower, and also to advance specific narratives and specific interests. And I personally see the work of Dr. Hotez as fitting very well into this framework of looking at crisis in this critical way. Thank you.
Well, they definitely got more money. Like the Biden administration, then I think they put together something like $80 billion for. They announced that, I can't remember what year it was, where they said they were going to pour more money into biosafety, or how do they call it? Like, they didn't call it biowarfare. They call it what's the term they use?
Biodefense.
Biodefense.
Yeah.
Biodefense. Yeah, biosecurity. There you go. Yeah. Which I think is funny because to me, I think it's like this whole like it's obviously wordplay because, I mean, it's called an AR-15 assault rifle, or it could be called an AR-15 defense rifle. Like, it's the same thing. You just gave it a different name. And I think that's what they've done. I think that's true. Is they've definitely used this event as a reason to like tune up and then go back to the appropriators in Congress and say, like, well, we told you why we need more money. This is exactly why we need the money.
And Paul, so I guess maybe I don't want to misrepresent what Jan is saying, but I think this relates to something that Jay and I were talking about last night, is that Peter Hotez in particular has made his career on the exploitation of poor or marginalized communities. And I think, Jay, you had sort of mentioned this concept. It came up because we were talking about how he went and did selfies with a stack of tires. And he said, I'm standing with tires to emphasize that low-income communities are susceptible to are breeding grounds for disease. I don't know if it's, this idea of, like, you had mentioned this idea of like the white man's burden and him being like an example of that. I'm not sure if, Jana, is that kind of what you were referring to a bit with Hotez in terms of the way he exploits communities and uses poor communities to advance his own career?
I mean, I can't speak to that. I'm not that familiar with that side of Dr. Hotez. I think that the type of exploitation I see is the gross simplification of very, very complex issues, like, for example, vaccines, masks. There's nuances and subtleties in all of these issues, gross simplification, and then all out attack as anti-science and worse of people who dare grapple with the true complexities of those issues. And beyond that, then building on that is painting a picture of science being under attack, by the way, parenthesis, by people who are thinking scientifically and therefore in complex ways, and are injecting, presenting that as a threat to science, and in this case, and I think of other professionals as well, gaining, grants, getting awards, being elevated as the, official spokesperson and warrior in defense of science, when the work that's being done actually seems quite unscientific.
I see what you mean. I was going to say, I guess, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up. I wanted to ask Jay if he could sort of end commenting on what the status of the conference is, and generally, is this what impact will all of this criticism have on the conference itself?
So the conference is going forward on October 4th. It's open to registration by the public. So if you want to go register, you're welcome to come and attend. I'm working hard to make sure that each of the panels is balanced. So we have the kind of rich discussion that we've had here on how to manage pandemics in the future, as well as that panel on biosafety, as you said, Bryce. It's, I think, the first major panel held at a university where these topics are going to be brought up. So yeah, I'm really quite pleased with how the conference is going. I think a lot of these attacks are just noise to try to problematize the conference. Actually, just what they do is they draw attention to it. And Jan, I agree with you about what it's how irresponsible the actions that Peter Hotez. I mean, he's essentially trying to demean the conduct of science itself, which requires these kinds of discussions, where the complexities are sort of start to get brought out. I mean, none of these have any simple answers, as you can tell from the conversation we've had.
Hey Jay, one thing I think you should do is I think you should send a formal invitation to Peter Hotez.
Oh, I have
to come to Stanford and defend himself, because he's a coward. He's a total coward. He hides behind the fact that he's like under assault all the time. Okay, well that shows right that he's being attacked. The fact that he was invited to come to Stanford to talk shows he's under attack, I think. One could argue.
It's a really strange way to attack somebody, but yeah, I guess
that is true.
In a Peter Hotez way, it's how Peter Hotez thinks.
Well, I guess the other thing, Jay, I don't know. One would expect to see some more criticism of it, possibly some hit pieces coming out. Look for those. Can't wait on the conference. But at the end of the day, this is going to be, I think it's going to go forward. It's going to be a historic event. I'm looking forward to attending myself. And so with that, I'd like to just say thanks to, I guess Janine had left a little while ago, but I really appreciate her joining. Paul, thanks a lot again for joining. And Laura and Yana, thanks for participating. Jay, good luck with everything. And I guess we will, let's see, what is it? Yeah, we'll be back, I believe, next week. I'm not sure what we will discuss, but take care, everyone. Until then.
I know.